God wrote a certain story on women's hearts. Women love relationships. They buy magazines about relationships. They watch TV shows about relationships. These movies. Relationships are very important to women. That's not to say that they're not important to men, but they take primacy in a woman's heart. So when we describe the gospel as a personal relationship with a man who loves you, whose heart are we appealing to, men or women's? Primarily women's. Now, when men go to movies, they pick an action adventure film where there's a bad guy and a hero who saves the world against impossible odds. Now, what's interesting is we used to describe the gospel as precisely that. You were going to hell. Jesus saved you by his work on the cross. We've got this great cause that we need to expend ourselves in. But we really shy away from those sorts of absolutes anymore, preferring the softer approach, the relational approach, which seems to appeal to women more than men.
Episode number 105. You can get all the show notes and resources at dadhackers.us/105. What's up, Dad Hackers? My name is Patrick Antonucci, and I am the host and founder of this podcast and community of Dad Hackers. Well, Dad Hackers is a community of Christian fathers who are devoted to encouraging, equipping, and enabling one another to become the men that God has created and called us to be, so that we can raise up the next generation of fully devoted followers of Christ and leave a legacy of multi-generational faithfulness. Now, on this show, we primarily interview Christian men to dive deep into their experiences and insights into what it means to be a Christian man, a Christian husband, a Christian father, and a Christian leader. We ask questions that dig deep into the thinking and rationale and experiences of these men so that we can all learn and grow into the men that God is calling us to be. I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. Make sure you subscribe so that you never miss any of our value-packed episodes. Also, please make sure you leave an honest review if you're listening to this in iTunes or any other platform that takes reviews. Reviews boost the show's ratings, which means that more dads are going to come across our show and benefit from the content that we put out. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a free private Facebook group just for Christian dads. So after the show, make sure you hop on over to the show notes. There's a link for that in there as well. David, welcome to the Dad Hackers podcast. How are you today, brother?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome, man. I'm honored to have you on the show. I look forward to our conversation. Why don't we start off and you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your context, and we'll roll from there.
Okay, well, I'm not a pastor or a professor or a theologian. I don't have a degree in anything holy. I don't get paid to be a Christian. I'm just a guy in the pews who about 20 years ago noticed a disturbing trend that the churches were losing their men and boys. My background is in media, television production specifically. And one of the things you learn when you're in the TV business is that everything has a target audience. For instance, who's the target audience of ESPN? It's guys, right? Yep. How about the Oprah Winfrey Network or HGTV? Who watches that? Mainly the women. Yeah. So one day I was sitting in church and suddenly it came to me. The target audience of my church was a 55-year-old grandma. All the ministries were kind of focused on her interests. You know, we had quilting circles and ladies' Bible studies. All the benevolence and outreach programs were surrounded children and family, potluck dinners, sewing banners and, you know, quilts and all these things for them. The way that church was decorated. So I thought, you know, there's somebody needs to write a book about this, and nobody had. So the Lord tapped me on the shoulder and said, you write it. And I said, God, I'm a TV producer. I don't do books. But God wouldn't leave me alone. Finally, that came out in 2005, Why Men Hate Going to Church, my first book, and it's just gone crazy, completely wrecked my life. And but now I go all over the country and all over the world speaking to groups and encouraging churches to be more welcoming to men and boys.
That's great, man. I'm really impressed with the book. I've read it. I know a ton of guys in the Dad Hackers community have read it, and it has impacted a lot of ministries. Let's maybe backtrack a little bit. Why do you think the church in Western civilization in particular is in the situation it is in with the over-feminization of the church? How did we get here?
Well, one of the things you need to understand is that all institutions tend to feminize over time. Most institutions are established by young men who have revolutionary ideas. And their idea is they want to overturn the culture and create something new. And this is what we see with church plants. For example, the ethos in a church plant is grow or die. You have to be very bold with outreach, evangelism, and these sorts of things. But then once church stabilizes, attendance and giving kind of stabilize, you move from a more outreach-oriented to a more in-reach-oriented. You stop fishing for men and you start creating a nice, safe aquarium for the saints. And that's when feminine values become more valuable. That's when it's more important to keep people happy than it is to possibly offend someone by breaching out or being very aggressive and bold with evangelism. So over time, like any institution, the church tends to feminize. It tends to embrace close-knit relationships instead of the more masculine values, which would be, let's get out there and win the world for Jesus. I'm sure you've seen that process in churches and different institutions you've been involved with as well.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that and totally understand where you're coming from on that. So does that mean that these feminine values and pursuits are bad or wrong? I don't know how to phrase that, but you get what I'm saying? The question?
No. You know, a church needs both masculine and feminine spirit. When Jesus came down, he found a church that was way too masculine. It was run by men. Women were trampled underfoot. When you get too much masculine spirit, you get legalism. Everything's a rule. You're going to obey or else. God is an angry, heartless God who just wants to take revenge. You know, it was the religion of the Pharisees. The problem is when people look at the scriptures, especially people who have more kind of liberal theological orientation, they look at the scriptures and they see Jesus fighting against the rules and they think, it's not about rules, it's about relationships. Well, that's a more feminine way of looking at the Bible. And so they throw the rules out. And I've always said that women will sacrifice rules on the altar of relationships, whereas men will sacrifice relationships on the altar of rules. Now, in a good, healthy church, you need both. You need rules and you need relationships. But the problem is, as I said in the earlier question, is that churches tend to feminize over time. They tend to throw out the rules. And this is what we're seeing in the decline of the liberal mainline churches. They've completely abandoned the rules so that everyone can feel loved and accepted. The problem is young men won't affiliate with a church without rules. They certainly won't, put shoulder to the wheel. They're looking for a cause that they can die for. And the weakness and the gentleness and the meekness of these older mainline liberal churches offers them nothing.
Wow, that's very well put. You hit on a good point, and I remember reading this in your book about how the phrase, it's not about rules, it's about relationships, is not actually biblical. Could you speak to that a little bit more and tease that out a little bit, maybe the distinction, the balance, and how rules fit into, because we hear how rules fit into Christianity, because we hear a lot about, especially today, about God's grace, his forgiveness, his mercy, and this constant theological battle over, there's nothing you can do to be saved, which I agree, Christ has done the work on the cross, but there are rules. I mean, there are guidelines and principles and those kind of things.
Yeah. And the rules are there for our benefit. I mean, anybody this is a dad's podcast, right?
Of course.
I mean, Dads, why do you give your kids rules? So that you can rule over them and be angry at them when they disobey? No, you're giving them rules because you love them and you realize that, and you're smarter than they are, and you want them to obey the rules so they have a good, satisfying life, right? That's why that's why we do the things we do. It's not so we can be angry at our kids. But a lot of society has kind of forgotten that they don't understand why the rules are there. I mean, why would the Bible prohibit two men who love each other from being married? Why is that rule there? We don't take well to rules that would seem to contradict the command to love one another and these sorts of things. Now, speaking of relationships, the phrase that never appears in the scripture is that I was speaking of in the book is personal relationship with Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Yet, even though that never appears in the Bible, it's the number one way Christian evangelicals describe the Christian walk, which is kind of curious since we're so Bible-oriented, yet we use a phrase that doesn't even appear in the scriptures as our number one way of describing Christian discipleship. Now, why do we use that phrase, personal relationship with Jesus? I like to use an example from the movies. When I pick out a movie on Netflix or go to the movies, I always, what kind of movie? Well, what kind of movies do you like? Do you like chick flicks or do you like adventure films?
I like adventure films, and
Yeah,
I do watch the
yeah.
chick flicks with my wife. I know she likes it, and so I try to participate like that. But I mean, the action packed adventure films, I mean, those always have a
Yeah,
good
I mean,
place in my heart.
what would you, yeah, what speaks to your heart, you know?
Right.
Here's the difference. In a chick flick, the whole point of the movie is a relationship. It's all about a couple who are star-crossed, they fall in the water, she lives in a beautiful apartment in New York. You know, you've seen these all the time.
Yeah.
But the whole point at the end is so these two star-crossed lovers can find each other for a personal relationship. Now, why are those movies so popular with women? Because God wrote a certain story on women's hearts. Women love relationships. They buy magazines about relationships. They watch TV shows about relationships. These movies. Relationships are very important to women. That's not to say that they're not important to men, but they take primacy in a woman's heart. So when we describe the gospel as a personal relationship with a man who loves you, whose heart are we appealing to, men or women's? Primarily women's. Now, when men go to a movies, they pick an action adventure film where there's a bad guy and a hero who saves the world against impossible odds. Now, what's interesting is we used to describe the gospel as precisely that. You were going to hell. Jesus saved you by his work on the cross. We've got this great cause that we need to expend ourselves in. But we really shy away from those sorts of absolutes anymore, preferring the softer approach, the relational approach, which seems to appeal to women more than men.
Yeah, that very good points there. Very good points. Another thing that I wanted to ask you was with respect to if I'm looking at my church, my congregation, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and other men, and I've been brought up in this church, or this is the only church experience I have. What are kind of some red flags of the over feminization of a congregation? And then I want to get into some other things after that. But what would we see? How does that manifest itself in a local body?
Well, believe it or not, architecture and decor are very important. Men have an instinctive, men instinctively avoid feminine spaces. Like whenever my wife goes into Hobby Lobby or Joanne Fabrics, I have no interest in going in there. Real frou-frou tea shops or the lingerie section at the J.C. Penney. I'm just not interested in going into those spaces because those are women's spaces. So if your church is decorated like a grandma space, which a lot of them are, with quilts and flowers and ribbons and banners and lace,
Doilies.
yeah, or these children, kindergarten style bulletin boards with construction paper and yarn showing where our missionaries are. And it just has a very classroom mama type feel to it.
Mm.
So the easiest thing you can do is redecorate the church, use the colors of the field. I even know a couple of churches that have pulled down the quilted banners and have put animal mounts on the walls, animals that were taken in hunting. And guys come in there and they're like, whoa, I'm in a church. This is fantastic. It's just, especially if you live in an area, like Missouri or Arkansas or a place where there's a really strong hunting culture. You can put, natural rock stone on the wall, put up a few mounts, and you have guys coming in there like crazy. That's been one of the success of the cowboy church movement. You sit on bales of hay, there's animals all around, guys feel very comfortable with lariats and, cowboy gear around. It's all about creating an environment when a man walks in, he feels like this is something for him and not just something for his grandma. So decor and environment is definitely one thing. We've already talked about language, not emphasizing the relationship so much as the mission. It's important. Ministries for men, make sure that you use terminology that men can relate to. One of the things that I always kind of object to is when we get men together, we always talk about purity, sexual purity. Purity's for soap. I would talk about sexual potency. That's what men want. That's why you want to teach them not to be in porn. You want to teach them not porn so you can be potent again. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, kind of flip the script on that.
Yeah, why are we trying to be pure little damsels? Let's be men, okay? Uh, Describing Jesus, not just as this gentle, meek, kind of girlish character who wouldn't hurt a fly. Let's use the actual example of the scripture. He blew up with volcanic anger. And more than once did he do that. It wasn't just the time he overturned the tables. I mean, one time he got so angry at Peter, he called him Satan. Can you imagine how angry you'd have to be if you're God and you're calling somebody Satan? I mean, that would be like calling a Holocaust survivor Hitler. I mean, that's the worst thing you can say to somebody. So, I mean, we just need to stop sugarcoating who Jesus is and what his message is, and just be perfectly honest about the manliness of Christ. And I think men would be intrigued and want to follow that sort of savior.
Amen, brother. The follow-up question to that is, we've been talking a lot about bringing masculinity back into the church, and because it's missing, a lot of men aren't there. So what's the difference that if we shift, swing the pendulum the other way and go more masculine, are all the women going to now leave the church and it's just going to be, the golf club? Why is it okay to have a more masculine oriented congregation, but not an overly feminine one?
A couple of reasons. Number one, the return of men has been the secret sauce in the megachurch movement. Mm-hmm. There is not a megachurch in America that is not actively targeting men. Now, they do this on the sly. They don't go out and say, hey, this is a guy-oriented church. But what they've done, you won't find a quilted doily, a lace doily. The music is upbeat the way guys like it. The sermon series in mega churches are all about power and victory. And I mean, it's just, you can just tell they have figured this out, because if you get the guy in the door, you usually get the women and children in the deal. The other thing you need to understand about men and women is that, and I call this Murrow's ironclad rule of the genders. Women flock to masculine things, but men are repelled by feminine things. And as an example, I use two stores that are next door to each other in my hometown of Anchorage, Alaska. One is the Home Depot, and the other is Joann Fabrics. Now, every Wednesday night, the Home Depot in Anchorage has a do-it-herself night. And they invite women to come in and teach them how to build things. And women gain a great amount of social capital by this. Every Thursday morning, those women go back to their offices, get together with the rest of the girls, and they say, you'll never guess what I did last night. I went to Home Depot and learned how to work a bandsaw. And all the other women are, ooh, you are so cool. Now, I keep going into Joann Fabrics looking for a do-it-himself night. Haven't seen one yet. I can't imagine a guy going to work the next day after going to Joann's and saying, hey guys, guess what I did last night? I went to Joann's and learned how to make decorative pillow shams. You see the difference here?
Said no guy
women
ever.
love
Right.
to do guy things, but guys hate to do women things. So if you create a church environment that errs on the side of masculine, you're going to get men and women and young boys and young girls. All are going to be interested in that type of environment. And you keep hearing this from women too. Women hate women's ministry. Why? Because it's all ladies' teas and stuff. Women these days have been raised in a post-feminist world. They don't want to just sit around and gossip. They want to do something. So you have to create this masculine vibe, and you're going to get everybody. If you create a feminine vibe, you're going to get a bunch of cranky old women who are upset because you moved the lace doily off the communion table.
So one of the other things that you hit on in the book that I thought was particularly interesting is the invitation time at the end of a sermon, and how lots of churches present it in a more feminine light. Could you hit on that really quick about how a couple of tweaks that preachers could make whenever they're doing the invitation at the end of their sermon?
Well, it goes back to what we talked earlier about the personal relationship with Jesus, the highly emotive, the idea that there's a man out there who's totally in love with you and wants to take you into his arms. That sort of imagery is not going to appeal to men as much as it would be to join Christ in a dangerous mission. And now, if you don't mind, I'll segue off of that into music, because
Sure.
the trend in praise and worship music has been much more toward romantic imagery. Hold me close, let your love surround me. Jesus, I am so in love with you. God is our love object rather than our leader. A lot of these songs sound like Jesus is leading us into the bedroom rather than onto the battlefield. Fortunately, there's a trend away from that. A lot of worship leaders have started reading my book and following me on Facebook and stuff. And we're starting to see a trend toward more battle songs, toward songs that are more, that talk more about our mission with God rather than just our love relationship with God.
Awesome. Now, what about, so we've talked a little bit about some things that we can do in a congregation from maybe a leadership standpoint. We can change the decor, we can redecorate, we can change some of the music, we can change the terminology, we can even change how we phrase the invitation. But what about the man in the pew who's maybe not in leadership, or the man who wants to lead his family to Christ, but these things in the church kind of bother him? What can he do on his level to try to promote some change?
Well, I'll tell you what I had to do. I went to a kind of a feminized church and raised my kids there till my son was 12. And then identified a local megachurch in Anchorage that had a much more masculine spirit. The pastor was a former Iditarod musher, athlete, jock type pastor. And I knew my son would relate better to his preaching and his leadership. Because when you're 12 years old, it's all about being manly, right? 12, 13, 14. And so we actually made the painful decision to change churches based, not only what I needed in my, walk with Christ, but also because I knew my son would need that. And so if you're a dad, I would never, first of all, I'm not advocating you leave your church or abandon your church. I'm not about church hopping or church switching. But if your church is hopelessly feminized and you have sons, I would really look for a church with a very active youth group with a male youth leader. Someone that, because boys are notorious sexists, most boys will not follow a woman's spiritual leadership, no matter how dynamic she is. They're looking for a man to follow, and one with a properly masculine pastor that they can that those boys can relate to as they grow up.
Excellent points. What about a guy who's in a situation where that's not an option? Maybe nobody in a reasonable driving distance. There's no mega church. There's nothing like that. Are there some things that he can do maybe at home with his family to lead them spiritually? Or maybe phrasing this from a different light, a guy's wanting to make some changes and his wife has been the spiritual head of the family. What are some tweaks that he can kind of make to reassume the leadership without stepping all over her?
Well, first thing would be to explain to your wife what you're up to. Don't just suddenly unilaterally decide to change things. If I were having that conversation, I would say, honey, I feel like I've been a little passive in spiritual matters. Would you agree with that? Or I've let you take the lead and that's been my error. Would you agree with that? Just feel her out, see what she's thinking, right? She may well have felt that in the past, or it's possible that she grew up in a home where their mom was a spiritual leader and she doesn't notice at all. But then I would explain to her in terms of, I've done some research, I've read some articles, and I found that the father's enthusiasm for the things of God will determine, to a much larger degree, his children's enthusiasm for the things of God. And so I need to be a more visible spiritual leader in the house. Will you help me do that? 99 out of 100 women are going to be like, yes, I've been waiting for you. Step up. There's going to be that one angry feminist who says, no, let me do it. Okay, great, honey. Maybe I shouldn't have married. No, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, 99 out of 100 women are going to be all over that. So then try to be more visible in your enthusiasm for the things of God, personal devotions at home, getting the kids up. Come on, kids, it's time to go to church. It's time to worship God. Time to see our godly, our Christian friends. Lead something. Lead a ministry at church. Just show them your enthusiasm and your zeal for the gospel. And that's going to be the most important, powerful witness of anything you could do.
Awesome. I like it because I think a lot of guys are in a situation where it's not a feasible option for them to leave the church that they're at for a multitude of reasons. But I want guys to know that there are things that they can do to take personal responsibility for the situation and personal responsibility for their families. And I'm really glad you mentioned the things that you talked about.
Well, yeah, and I'll mention one other thing too. I mean, even in the last 20 years since I was raising little ones, there's just been a proliferation of dad tools out there. I call them tools that help fathers and mothers, but especially fathers, lead spiritual conversations with their kids. And you just look around for them. Focus on the Family has some. There's just a lot of really good templates out there for having conversations that your kids may act very blasé about, but they're actually enjoying. So just man up and have the conversations, and learn to ask lots of good questions. So, son, what do you think about this? Do you think God can really heal people? And then just let him say whatever he's going to say. And then take him to the scriptures. Well, he didn't heal grandma. So why do you really think, just let him really, kids these days like to ask questions. So, let them ask questions, and don't be afraid of some ambiguity. You don't have to be the Bible answer man, but just at the end of the conversation, reaffirm your faith in God. And I think that'll be a very powerful witness to your kids.
Yeah, what I hear you saying, kind of embedded in part of that answer there, talking about all the dad tools that are out there, is that we have so much at our fingertips. We really don't have an excuse for not being able to lead spiritually in our families.
Well, I mean, yeah, we've never had an excuse. I've failed many times with my kids. I wish I'd been more intentional about showing my enthusiasm for the things of God, but there's always, especially if the kids are small, just what do you want? What do you want out of life? Do you want your kid to become a Major League Baseball player? What are the odds of that? Or do you want him to be a godly man who leads his family? Well, which is more likely to happen? Is he likely to play second base for the New York Yankees? Or is he probably going to be married and need to lead kids? So it's probably the latter. So put your energy where the odds are, take him to baseball practice, but along the way, hey, how can I pray for you, son? That's one of the simplest questions you can ask. Just let your kids know you are praying for them regularly.
One more question, and then I want to get into like the second half of our interview where we're going to kind of shift gears and talk about some other things. But let's talk for a second about actual men's ministries. I have some men in the Dad Hackers community who are leaders of small groups of men. They're doing men's ministry for their church, or they're participating in men's ministry in their church. What are some maybe best practices you've seen in terms of men's ministries in local congregations, or things that men that are leading these smaller communities of men, what are some things that they can do to kind of promote the ministry and in the ministry there?
Okay. Well, that's an odd question for me because I'm not really a men's ministry program guy. My focus is helping churches with the front door experience. I don't really have a lot of expertise as far as discipleship programs for men. Mainly what I do is say, all right, we're going to create a net that catches men, brings them into the church, and then once they're there, you're responsible for discipling them. You see, that's my focus. However, having said that, there's an organization out there called the National Coalition of Ministries to Men, ncmm.org. NCMM is what it is. And they have over 150 partner organizations that are members. I'm a member of it as well. And there's like probably 75 organizations within NCMM that promote exactly what you're talking about. These are men's discipleship programs that take place in a local church context. Everyone from Man in the Mirror to Iron Sharpens Iron. There's a lot of really, really good men's curriculum content and solutions for keeping momentum, building a successful men's ministry program in your church. So I would definitely check out ncmm.org and send the webmaster a question or check through the membership directory and reach out to some of those organizations. And there are people who have made all the mistakes before you. They can keep you from falling into the holes, and they can help you create a men's ministry that definitely will survive and thrive.
Awesome. Thanks for that, David. I appreciate that resource, and I'll be sure to link that up in the show notes so guys can easily access that. All right, guys, wanted to take a quick second to tell you about the Iron Men Mastermind. If you're looking for a band of brothers that you can lock shields with, that can go to battle with you in the day-to-day life, who are also in the trenches, going through the same struggles and the same challenges that you are going through, I suggest you check out the Iron Men Mastermind. This mastermind was developed and designed for Christian men to help us become the men that God has created and called us to be. And it's designed to help us increase our relationship with God, increase our relationship with our wives, increase our relationship with our children, and begin to provide better for them financially, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, relationally, in all of those areas those things that wake you up in the middle of the night. These are the kinds of things that we work on. These are the kinds of ways that we can help you out in the Iron Men Mastermind. If this is something that is of interest to you, you may want to join the Iron Men community, and you can check out more information at dadhackers.us/Ironmen, one word, Iron Men there. All right, now back to our show. So you and I were talking before we hit the record button about some things you have coming up. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're working on, and then we can dive into some of that content.
Okay. Well, in the introduction to our interview, I mentioned to you that I'm a television producer by trade. I still make my living that way. I've been in the TV business for almost 40 years. And the TV business has definitely changed. It's evolved. TV is now in your pocket. And as a result, we're beginning to see a new generation of both men and women, but men in particular, becoming addicted to their screens. And we've had TV addicts since the 1950s. But the nature of the content is changing. The pervasive nature of carrying it around with us has really created a generation, particularly young adults, who are unbalanced in their lives. They're living their lives primarily on their screens, and they're spending up to 9 hours a day. That's the average American spends 9 hours a day involved with screen content.
Wow.
And so I really felt a call to shift the focus a little bit away from exclusively addressing men to writing a new book, which I'm calling Balancing Screen Life and Real Life. And so I'm going to give you an insider's view in that book of some of the tricks that the media uses to keep you involved with your screen, why pornography is such a lure for men, how it affects your brain, why social media seems to be absorbing a lot of women's time. And so I also took an interesting approach. I used 5 different parables at the beginning of the book to kind of help my readers understand what's happening to them and how the world is changing as a result of screens. But I'm sure a lot of your dads are using screens in ways that are inappropriate, or they're using them too much, or they may be ignoring their kids as a result of their screen use. And that's something that my book is designed to address, helping guys balance that screen life and real life again.
Yeah, I definitely know it's a huge issue. It's something that I have to battle every day and try to set boundaries around. And it's really hard to stick to those boundaries. We did a challenge a couple months back in the Dad Hackers community where it was put your phone down challenge. And the challenge was for men to put their phone down for 2 hours. And some of the feedback that we got from that was amazing. Just what the guys were doing during those 2 hours, engaging with their family, talking to their wife, doing things, and also the level of difficulty it is to put your phone in a drawer for 2 hours and not touch it. I mean, it's tough.
Right. Because what you have to understand is that one of the parables I tell in the story is it's actually taken from the Bible. It's the story of David the shepherd boy, and he's sitting on the hill. And he just spends hours looking at the clouds and looking at the trees and looking at his sheep and looking at the grass. And then all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he sees a wolf advancing on his sheep. And he's too far away to save the sheep. And so all of a sudden his blood pressure goes up and his eyes dilate and his dopamine levels and his neurotransmitters go crazy. And he reaches into his pouch and he swings the rock and he manages to hit the wolf, and the sheep is saved. What we have to understand is that our brains are meant to be stimulated like that about once a day or once a week, right? Wolves don't come naturally in the real world. But in the screen world, we can summon the wolf anytime we want. We can flood our brains with these neurochemicals, neurotransmitters, and dopamine, and these sorts of things. And what's happening is it's habituating our brains to novelty. So we see something new all the time. Whereas the natural world doesn't have that much novelty. It's very unnatural for us to be stimulating our brains like this all the time. And we're actually changing the chemistry of our brains. And the worst thing is we're kind of crowding out opportunities for contemplation, for prayer, for meditation. The time that we used to spend on those spiritual disciplines is now spent like this, on our iPhones, on our Androids, on our tablets and laptops, or just plain old TV or video games. So God is being pushed out of our lives. And, what we look at is what we worship. And I tell you what, screens are the object of modern worship. We spend 9 hours a day looking at them, adoring them, looking into their glowing faces, instead of taking time to be with our families or just being in the real world, being present in the real world.
Yeah, I definitely can see that even in my own life and in the lives of people that I know and come in contact with. I mean, it's very pervasive, and I see it all over the place, out in public, out to eat, in the workplace, in the church. I mean, everywhere. And you're right. I mean, I have my phone right here, and it's in my pocket. Usually it goes everywhere with me, and it's right there. All I have to do is pick it out, put in the password, and 2 seconds later, boom, I'm on the internet there. You mentioned about pornography, and I know that the use of pornography has skyrocketed since internet, and even more so since we've been able to access it, particularly pictures and videos through our phones. Why is it so gripping on the soul of a man?
Again, it's a function of brain chemistry. If you think about the normal pattern of sexual arousal, let's say you're a happily married man and you have an average sex life. You're having sex anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week. If you're an athlete, maybe 4 or 5 times a week, or a newlywed, maybe 7 times a week. But it usually settles down to 2 or 3 times a week by the time you've been married a few years. So that part of your brain that's supposed to be sexually stimulated by a woman's body is meant to go off 2 to 3 times a week. With pornography, you can stimulate that endlessly, hour after hour after hour, and it ends up dulling those neural. It's like if you could imagine a field of virgin snow, and a snowmobile goes along and carves a path through it. What you're doing is you're carving this very deep path into the neurotransmitters of your brain. And so what happens is you become used to this very high level of stimulation very frequently. You may also be masturbating, which is releasing all the pressure behind the dam, so to speak. So when it comes time to perform with your wife or with a real woman, you don't have any pressure left. And you're used to a level of sexual stimulation that no woman, an imperfect woman, could possibly provide. So it's very easy to become hooked on it. Most young men have their first experiences with porn at age between 10 and 12. That's a time when our brains are very plastic. Our brains will naturally seek out novelty, especially when we're children. We like to explore new things, and porn, seeing a naked woman, is definitely a new thing. It's at a time when our hormones are surging. So our brains are just no match for pornography. It's unhealthy in every way. It's unnatural. People say, "Oh, it's just natural." It's very unnatural to see people engaged in sex acts. There's been almost no society ever where that's been a natural thing. So, I mean, that's kind of a long-ranging answer just to say this, that porn is a very powerful thing because of what it does to your brain. And if you're going to get out of it, you need some sort of accountability structure. And fortunately, those solutions are out there, and they're helping lots of people.
Yeah, I was going to ask, whenever you were going through the details of why pornography is so addictive, how to get out of that, because I know it's insane, the very high percentage of Christian men who are in ministry that are addicted to pornography or look at pornography on a regular basis. Now, I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but do you know at what point it's considered that you're addicted to pornography or even addicted to your phone? You know what I'm saying?
Well,
Like, is it like, do I look at it twice a day, 3 times a week? I mean, is it a number thing? I mean, how do I determine if I'm actually addicted or if I'm just like a social user of this stuff?
that's a self-assessment, of course. There's no clinical line. Well, if you use 4.5 hours a week, I would say that any amount of porn use is indicative of addiction. There's no amount of porn use that is healthy or safe.
Right, right.
Studies have shown that even using it once a month causes a decrease in sexual satisfaction when you're with a real woman. So it's kryptonite. It's something that needs to be completely avoided. One of the things that we've learned in the last 20 years of dealing with internet porn came about in 1998, so we've been dealing with it about 20 years or so. One of the things that we've learned is we tried to block it at first. The largest Christian blocking software was called Covenant Eyes. It's still around.
Yeah, I have it on my computer.
Yeah, terrific stuff. And it does work by blocking a lot of websites. But one of the things Covenant Eyes is learning is that there are so many different platforms and so many different sites, and porn can be hidden in so many different ways. It's like a game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
One thing, as soon as they get one filtered, another one pops up. So they've actually changed their approach to an accountability system.
Yeah.
Where, let's say you're porn watching Pete and you're tired of being beaten by pornography. You go to your friend Mike and you say, Mike, would you hold me accountable? Mike says, sure, let's do it. So you both sign up for Covenant Eyes. And then every time Pete is on one of his devices, it sends the software takes screenshots of what you're watching. Artificial intelligence looks at those, can tell if this is pornography. Mike gets a report, and then Mike busts your chops. So just the pressure of knowing that somebody else knows, that's James chapter 5, confess your sins one to another,
yes,
that you may be healed.
Right.
Well, now we're using the power of the screens that bring us this will. Now we're turning it against them. We're bringing accountability onto our screens using software. So I think Covenant Eyes approach is absolutely great. I don't know if you've been on their website. They have this hilarious video of this Superman. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't seen that video.
You have to go.
I'll have to check it out.
Okay, I'm not shilling for them. They're not paying me any money for this. But they have done the most hilarious 5-minute video that talks about how their stuff works. It features this superhero. It's great. You got to go to Covenant Eyes website and watch their video. But anyway, there are other groups like the Conqueror series. If you want to work on pornography addiction in a group in a church, the Conquer series, they do Conquer groups. You watch these 6 very well produced videos. It leads to table discussion, some confession there. I will tell you one of the areas you got to be careful though with confession. In 26 states, we have what are called mandatory reporting laws. And one of the guys in your group confesses to ever having watched child pornography, you have to report him to the authorities. So unless you want to start sending guys to jail, you've got to be very clear that you don't want to hear about that, because you could put your pastor could start sending people to jail. It's a very thorny, very, very thorny issue to be dealing with. But I'm confident that mutual accountability, that discretion, and that a great deal of compassion can overcome these addictions.
Yeah, we have Covenant Eyes on most of our devices. My work computer won't let me put it on there. It messes everything up for some reason. But we do get the emails, and it tells you every morning you get an email with an accountability report. It's pretty neat. And you're right about the screenshots. And the neat thing that they do with the screenshots is if you have something that they flag, for example, one night my wife and I were watching Netflix and an ad came up for some movie, and it had a man and woman in bed. and it flagged that. And
Good. Yeah.
And then on the screenshot, what happens is it's blurred out, and you can decrease the level of blurriness to figure out, you know, if you needed to really figure out if it was like, what is that? Is that really a something going on there, or is that just an accidental red flag? But I know myself, when I'm looking at my phone, I'm like, oh no, you know, something just pops up. You know, it doesn't even have to be pornographic. It could be a scantily clad
Sexy
woman.
image. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
An ad or something pops up. And like, I find myself thinking twice more about even tapping on somebody's profile if I don't know them, or something of that nature. So I never really thought about I've thought about accountability, but not from the angle that you're speaking of, and how Covenant Eyes really uses accountability to your advantage. And yeah, I'll link their information up in the show notes as well. In that Conqueror series, I'll look for that and try to link that up as well. Did you have any more to say on that, or do you want to move to the next thing?
Yeah, well, the screen issue is so much bigger than pornography.
Right.
One of the things that I track in my parables at the beginning of the book is I talk about David the shepherd boy, but then I talk about David the king. And so when David the shepherd boy he was large, he was stuck with the people he lived with his tribe. He had very little power. He made very few decisions. When he became king, all of a sudden he had all these powers. He had a vast harem at his beck and call. He decided who was in his court, and he could banish rivals. And what our screens do is they make us into digital kings, digital monarchs. We can actually create this online world over which we reign as Lord and Master. And if we don't like somebody, we unfriend them. Boom, they're gone, they disappear. If we see some opinion we disagree with, banished, gone. We have this vast array of goods that's available to us. Amazon.com has 119 million products. King David couldn't even imagine that much wealth. So what happens is over time, the digital world allows us to create what I call the digital castle. It's this fortress into which we retreat. And within that castle, we reign as absolute Lord and Master of our little kingdom. And this is turning us into tyrants. I mean, I look at Christian men on social media, and some of them behave like absolute bores, absolute, there's no love, because they're in their castle and they're absolutely convinced that what they believe is right. And they're going to make everybody else believe it too. The world's going to hell, and all those dummies out there who don't do this, boy. And their attitude is the exact opposite of the humility that we need to be showing to others right now. So I think probably the most harmful effect is not what we're watching, but what screens are, but the world that screens allow us to create, and how isolated we become. Because that was the hallmark of David, the latter part of David's life. When he became king, he became isolated from his family, isolated from the people who loved him. That's why he took Bathsheba into his bed. He was lonely. While in the spring of the year, when kings were off at war, he wasn't out fighting.
Yeah, he didn't go.
He was at his house, waking up in the afternoon. So he had isolated himself within his castle, and that's the worst thing that screens do to us, is they allow us to isolate and create a digital world that's to our preference. And we're not allowing ourselves to be molded and shaped by difficult people and ideas that we may not agree with. And we're convinced of our absolute rightness and righteousness. And that's and it's caustic.
Yeah, I find that to be very true with respect to how boorish people men can become on the internet, Christian men. I've seen, people ask, and you could tell when they ask these questions on posts on Facebook or Instagram, and they're just baiting questions. They're like old theological questions that have been debated for centuries. They're never going to be settled, but they ask them anyway because they know it's going to get a lot of comments and controversy. And you'll see people just go back and forth and vehemently fighting with one another. And, very strong positions on either side, and just fighting. So I kind of have two rules for myself. I don't get into Facebook debates or comment debates. And if somebody comments on something that's mine and it's like controversial or very negative, I have a one response rule. I'll respond to you maybe one time, but after that, I'm not going to continue to respond and participate in that. And maybe that's some of my lordship over my own kingdom, but that's also a boundary I set, because then I can get sucked into that debate, and you're not going to settle theological debates in the comments on social media either. So.
No, nobody's ever been converted on Twitter.
No. A lot of people have been turned away, though. And I think that's some of the damage, because you see Christians lobbing arrows at one another from either side of the theological spectrum. And then the real person that's wounded is the person that was thinking or curious about the gospel, but was turned off because of all of that garbage that's going on.
And the problem isn't disagreeing or discord. It's disrespect. It's contempt. Mm-hmm. You know, we can't, as the people of God, we cannot show contempt for those with whom we disagree. It's an absolute, we just have to, even people with the craziest ideas, we still have to respond with love and we'll say, I respectfully disagree with that, and then present our case. But there's just so much contempt. And I think that's the mark of an immature Christian.
Right. So if I find myself addicted, and you may not be able to answer this, or maybe we'll have to get the book to get the answer to this question.
Hey, I don't know. You got to buy
the book. But if I feel that I am addicted to my screen, not just pornography, but my screen, social media, my phone, what are some steps I can take to begin to break free from that?
It's the same as any other sin. It's confession. Repentance, confession, and accountability. And, these have been prescribed by the Bible for 2,000 years. You need to talk to somebody and you say, I think I'm using my screens too much. If you're married, the obvious person to talk to would be your
wife.
Right. Thank you. And then we'll see what she says. Honey, am I using my screens too much? She'll let you know. She'll be happy to tell you.
Yeah, she probably knew before you did. Yeah.
She probably did. Yeah. She may even have been saying things or dropping little hints. So just say, is my relationship with screens unhealthy? What do you see? Be a mirror for me. Okay. That's humility. So that repentance, that repentant attitude. The second thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go to your kids and you're going to say, kids, I'm sorry. There have been times when you've come into the living room and I've ignored you because I've been looking at my tablet, or I've been watching TV, or I've been blasting aliens on World of Warcraft or whatever it is. And I'm sorry, and I want you to help me. When you come into the room, I want you to get in my face, and I'm going to turn everything off, and I'm going to give you my full attention. Now, that's a repentant dad right there.
Amen.
You make that promise to your kids, and you say, whenever it is, you can have my attention. Now, there may be a few times, like when I'm on a business phone call that I can't break away. Every other time, I'm going to put that screen down, okay? Your kids will accept the fact that you might have to be on a phone call every once in a while. So that would be the second step as far as rebuilding. And then the third step, if it's a more hardcore thing or an issue that you have a hard time breaking, there's something called a digital detox. That's where you can either do a self-directed digital detox where you take an extended period of time, anywhere from 2 to 7 days, without any screens. And I talk about that in my book, and the upcoming website that I'm launching will walk you out how to do a self-directed digital detox. You could do that alone, or you can do that with your wife or a friend or something like that. Just make sure nobody's got any devices. If you are even more hardcore addicted than that, you may need to go to some sort of a digital retreat. I'm starting next year in 2021, I'm going to start leading retreats where we get together in beautiful spaces. We're going to be device free. I'm going to be talking to you about the different strategies you can use to balance screen life and real life. Again, it's going to be a lot of fun. We're doing a lot of hands-on activities and talking about the real issues that lead to our compulsions in the beginning. And then if you're really super hardcore addicted, there are actually some inpatient treatment facilities now where particularly video gaming addicts are going, young men who are completely absorbed in their video game world. And there's some scary stories about those guys. And there's actually some facilities popping up for them where clinical treatment is available. So the nice thing is, the bad news is screens are very pervasive. They're very addictive. The good news is there's plenty of help out there if you do want to balance screen life and real life again.
Yeah, it's interesting, the process that you talk about, repentance, confession, and accountability, and how that's a biblical process. And that has been the process for thousands of years, and it still works even today. Imagine that.
Imagine that.
So David, when do you have a release date yet, an anticipated release date, or are we going to have to, bite our teeth until further notice?
Well, we're looking at probably January of 2021. Assuming, as we're recording this right now, we're in the middle of this lockdown on the coronavirus that could cause the release date to slip a little bit. But right now we're looking at January of 2021 for a release. I'm also going to be creating right now my website is churchformen.com. I'm going to create a new website at davidmurrow.com. And that's where I'm going to be putting all this screen stuff and how to get treatment and how to get free and links to different ministries and organizations that are Dave approved. And that will help you not only beat screens, but also in your walk with God. So you can look for that at davidmurrow.com. That'll probably release later in the fall.
Okay. Well, as we wind down here, David, I really appreciate your wisdom, your insight, and your willingness to come on and share with the Dad Hackers community. Is churchformen.com the best place men can go right now to get a hold of what you're doing and view some of your resources?
Yeah, and I'm a hypocrite. I'm on Facebook. I do a real active Facebook page, probably post 4 or 5 times a day, which is my weakness still, but facebook.com/churchformen. And so I'd be glad to welcome you there. You can send me a direct message through that portal. And I check my own stuff, and I'd be happy to get back with you. Any questions you may have.
All right, man. Well, great. I'll be sure to link both of those up in the show notes. And one final question, since this is a podcast for dads, I always like to ask my guests the same question. And that is, David, in your opinion, what makes a great dad?
Oh, okay. A great dad is someone who always has something to give. When I went through a season of counseling about 10 years ago to deal with some of my issues with my dad. And my counselor said something profound to me. I don't know if it will be to you, but he says, David, you have much more love to give than you realize. I'd grown up in kind of a love-starved environment. It was based on performance. And so I tended to hold back on my compliments, hold back on my kind words, use them carefully. And he said, David, you have so much more love to give. Just give it out freely. Because a real man is someone who walks into a situation and always has something to give to someone else. So I've tried to practice that with my kids, even if it's just a kind word, a smile, a wink. Now my kids are grown, they're adults, but I still, every time I interact with them, I try to give them something. And that's spilled over into other parts of my life. When I meet somebody on the street, I always want to have something to give to them. And God enables me to keep that tank full. There's always some kind word or a good question or something to draw them out. That's what a real man does, is he always has something to give.
Well, David, I really appreciate that answer. And that is so very true. And that tank never runs dry. It's just always full, always got something to give.
The Holy Spirit is always filling it up. I'm very thankful for that.
Amen. Well, brother, I really appreciate you coming on the show and taking time out of your day. And I look forward to the release of your new book. And I really highly encourage men, if you've not read Why Men Hate Going to Church, make sure you grab a copy of that excellent resource there with some very practical tips on what you can do in addition to the things that we mentioned here. And you have a whole lot of different resources on your website as well. Is that right?
Yeah, churchformen.com. I've got a bunch of free resources you can download. And just poke around the website. Let me know what you think.
All right, brother. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. All right, gentlemen, that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope our conversation was a blessing to you and that you leave this episode better equipped to be the man and the father God has called and created you to be. If so, then I ask that you please leave us a 5-star rating and a quick written review in iTunes. Then make sure you head on over to the show notes to get all of the resources for this episode. While you're there, you can take part in our 5 Days to Be a Better Dad challenge, as well as get involved with our free Facebook community. All right, gentlemen, until next week, remember Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Stay sharp.